All right, so as I said earlier in the show, we covered the interview that the Teamster president, Sean O'Brien, did on Fox News regarding JD Vance when Vance was unveiled as President Trump's running mate. And the Teamster president was obviously very enthused about JD Vance's vice presidential candidacy. And he didn't just praise JD Vance in general, but specifically listed numerous actions that JD Vance has taken as a senator in order to benefit and protect and advance the interest of the American worker. And remember, JD Vance has essentially built his identity on his dedication to the working class. He was raised in poverty, had all kinds of drug problems in his family, extreme amounts of poverty, went to college on to a state school, Ohio State University, on a scholarship, made his way to Yale Law School, and then wrote the definitive book that millions of Americans read on the Appalachian and working class culture, the Hillbilly Elegy. And one of the reasons why he was backed by the populist wing of the Republican Party is precisely because he, along with Josh Hawley and several other Republicans who want to bring the party away from this servitude to large capital and major concentrated corporate power, and instead become the party of the working class, the multiracial working class, which the party is in the process of becoming, understand that in order to do that, you actually have to show that your loyalty is not to multinational conglomerates, but instead to the American worker. You have to actually do things concretely, not just in words, but in actions, to demonstrate the authenticity of that belief. And the Teamster Union president not only believes, but has listed all the things that JD Vance did in order to become one of the most pro-worker members of the Senate. And I found that extraordinary that he would go on Fox News and heap praise on the vice presidential running mate, given how long and how unbreakable has been the connection, the partnership between labor union leaders on the one hand and the Democratic Party on the other. But after our show was over, or maybe even during it when we were live, Sean O'Brien did something even more amazing. He went to the Republican National Convention and he spoke there, and he not only heaped praise again on JD Vance, but also Josh Hawley and this wing of the Republican Party that he believes is becoming pro-labor, and said some amazing things that I think are so worth watching, in part because of who it came from, but also because of what he said, that is illustrative of this realignment where politics really can't be understood anymore as being between Democrats and Republicans. I mean, ultimately, what is really the difference between Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer on the one hand and Marco Rubio and Mitch McConnell on the other? Some culture war fights that they kind of half-heartedly have as theater, but not much else. And then you have this populist swing on the left wing of the Democratic Party and this populist right wing that are agreeing more and more on things like intervention in war and foreign policy, corporatism, and globalist international institutions. JD Vance gave an interview to the New York Times columnist Roth Dufat several days ago before he was named President Trump's running mate. And one of the things JD Vance said is that there is a part of the Democratic Party whose politics I feel a connection to, that I'm actually open to. And he said it's not the part of the party, the Democratic Party, that is the establishment center-left, because they're basically the same as the establishment center-right. They serve the same big corporate donors. They have the same neoliberal view, the same view of militarism. He actually said the part of the Democratic Party with which I share certain beliefs on trade, on labor, on wars, is what he called the Bernie Bros. Now, imagine in the past a Republican senator being considered as the vice presidential choice for the Republican nominee to come out and say the part of the Democratic Party with which I feel some affinity is not the centrists or the mainstream part of the party. I have contempt most for them and their mirror image of my party. It's what's considered to be the left of the Democratic Party. That would be absolutely unthinkable. And yet the reason that he can say that is because there is this realignment where less and less, it's not about left versus right or Democrat versus Republican or conservative versus liberal. but about whether you support establishment institutions of authority and their establishment dogma, or whether you oppose it. And increasingly, there are members of the Republican Party who clearly oppose it. And when Trump ran in 2016, the greatest appeal he had was that he presented himself as an enemy of the establishment and their ideology, not of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, but equally of both. He promised to drain the bipartisan swamp in Washington, all of that. And there was a lot of backtracking and a lot of things that happened during his administration that didn't align with that, often contradicted it. But the fact that he chose a 39-year-old Marine who has built his life on this culture, on this working class culture, and now in the Senate has developed policies that excite the Teamster president, demonstrates this realignment that so many people on the left, including the kind of pseudo-radicals on the left who love to believe that they're enemies of the Democratic Party, just simply can't accept. They just have to believe, it's almost like a religious conviction, that the only people who could possibly have any authentic concern for American workers are people who have a D after their name. That's the only possibility for authentic concern for the working class, is someone who's a Democrat. If someone has an R after their name, they can pretend to be a protector or believer in the working class, but they're just being fake. It's just for branding. They can't possibly have any genuine belief in that. I mean, it's such a binary and partisan and stunted view of the world because they refuse to acknowledge any kind of realignment at all, because they cannot see the world through any means other than this binary Republican versus Democrat, left versus right, etc., even though that's a very distortive and obfuscating prism through which to understand politics. And this incident, I think, illustrates that more than any I can remember in a long time. Here from The Guardian, Teamster president faces backlash over, quote, unconscionable Republican convention speech. So his going there, Sean O'Brien's going there, definitely created some division in American labor, because a lot of them just have it in their blood that they are tied to the Democratic Party. Sean O'Brien is accused of bolstering, quote, the most anti-union party and president by senior members of his own union. Quote, the Teamsters is one of the largest labor unions in the United States with 1.3 million members. While other large labor unions and the largest coalition of labor unions, the AFL-CIO, have already endorsed Joe Biden, the Teamsters has yet to make an endorsement in the 2024 presidential election. The credit for Union Facts, an organization founded by staunch union opponent and lobbyist Rick Berman, has paid for billboards in the Milwaukee area accusing the Teamsters of being a partisan group due to the union's political action committee predominantly supporting Democratic politicians. O'Brien's speech at the RNC will be the first time a Teamster president has spoken at the convention. In January 2024, the Teamsters PAC donated $45,000 to both the Republican and the Democratic National Committees, making its first donation to the Republican Party in years. And then it goes on to talk more about the internal disputes, but a lot of union members and a lot of top-level union officials, including Sean O'Brien, the head of the Teamsters Union, obviously believes that the American worker is better off not enslaved or subservient to the Democratic Party, but working with the factions in each party who are pro-labor. Now, here is the Teamsters president who spoke at the Republican National Convention, and here is part of his speech that we're going to show you a few segments of the speech, because it was really a remarkable speech. He didn't go and say, I love the Republican Party, I'm endorsing Trump and JD Vance. He was much more subtle and therefore interesting in the kind of remarks he made. So here's how he started off.
You know, corporatists hate when working people join together to form unions. But for a century, major employers have waged a war against labor by forming corporate unions of their own. We need to call the Chamber of Commerce and the business roundtables what they are. They are unions for big business. And here's another fact. Against gigantic multinational corporation, an individual worker has zero power. It's only when Americans band together in democratic unions that we win real improvements on wages, benefits, and working conditions.
Now, this is the kind of worldview that has become increasingly pervasive on both the populist left and populist right. It's driving populism throughout all of Europe, which is the idea that if you are pro-corporation, sort of embracing Reaganomics or Margaret Thatcher's ideology of economics, which may have applied to the 1980s but no longer applies now because it's just this idea that whatever big business wants is what we should do to make big business grow. Ronald Reagan's famous phrase for justifying that was a rising tide lifts all boats. So if there's growth because you're helping big corporations, it's going to help everybody. And it turned out that that wasn't really true, that over the course of the next several decades, the American worker suffered more and more. The middle class disappeared, real wages stagnated, and the more and more concentration there was in just a few corporate giants, the more the consumer got screwed, the more the worker got screwed. And that's a major reason why the working class has been migrating rapidly to the Trump-led Republican Party. Not just the white working class, but increasingly just everybody in the working class of all races. And the reason is because they know the Democratic Party has tied itself to corporatism and to big corporate donors who don't have any allegiance to the United States. They're multinational corporations. They're happy to have huge numbers of immigrants pouring into the country because they just look at that as cheap labor to drive down the wages of workers. And they know the Democratic Party has been behind a lot of that. And that's why working class people are shifting away from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, and the union's leaders understand that they have to recognize that new reality. Here is another clip from his speech last night.
President Trump had the backbone to open the doors to this Republican convention, and that's unprecedented. No other nominee in the race would have invited the Teamsters into this arena. Now, you can have whatever opinion you want, but one thing is clear. President Trump is a candidate who is not afraid of hearing from new, loud, and often critical voices. And I think we all can agree, whether people like him or they don't like him, in light of what happened to him on Saturday, he has proven to be one tough SOB.
Now, again, I play that because I just want to underscore how extraordinary it is that a labor leader, not a minor labor leader, a major labor leader, would go to the Republican National Convention and say these sorts of things. Part of what Reaganomics was about serving corporate leaders, serving big corporations, serving corporate power. And obviously that often came at the expense of the American worker. And there's always been a huge animosity toward labor unions inside many sectors of the American right and the conservative movement. And now there's a backlash against that because people understand that American workers have been decimated through free trade and globalization and the opening of the borders. And that's why working class towns have become destroyed. And a lot of people, including Republicans, are starting to understand. And there's that interview that I mentioned with JD Vance with Ross Dubois, where he said he empathizes more with the Bernie bro wing of the Democratic Party than the neoliberal corporatist wing, is also very interesting because there's an anecdote that he tells where he was at dinner with some major Republican donor, some extremely wealthy person, and JD Vance was there, and the extremely wealthy corporate executive began saying how great immigration was because it lets them pay workers very, very little. And JD Vance said it was in that moment that he realized, wait, I don't want to be part of this mentality. I don't want to screw over the American worker. I want to represent the American worker. I want to build the working class back up. And he talks about his trajectory of how he became that. Remember, he's only 39 years old. People are making a lot of what he said about President Trump in 2016, 2015. And I don't want to use the youth argument. He was certainly an adult, but he was 29 or 30. Lots of people go through their 30s and then have a change of view. And you should read that interview. I actually posted a gift article, a link as a gift article to it on Twitter earlier today for those of you who have access to my Twitter page, where you can just click on the link, even if you're not a subscriber, and read that interview with JD Vance, where there's a lot of space given to him to explain his worldview and his evolution. And a lot of people are having that same realization. Josh Hawley has often said that the Republican Party's only future is as a multiracial working class party. And obviously, in order to do that, you have to actually stand up to major concentrated corporate power and abandon this idea that the worst thing in the world are benefits or rights for the American worker, because that has been what has been gutted in the United States in subservience to international corporate power and globalist institutions. Here is a final excerpt that I want to show you from the speech last night. And really, the whole speech is really worth watching. It's only about 23 minutes long. We're just showing you a few excerpts. Here you can listen to this.
In the past, the Teamsters have endorsed GOP candidates, including Nixon, Reagan, and George H.W. Bush. But over the last 40 years, the Republican Party has really pursued strong relationships with organized labor. There are some in the party who stand in active opposition to labor unions. This, too, must change.
I mean, that's a lot of applause at the Republican National Convention for a line that says the hostility to organized labor must change. It really illustrates the change in the composition and the base of the Republican Party. These are working class people, largely, who formed the Trump movement. They don't want corporate bosses of major conglomerates to have their way, to be able to drive down wages. That's not why they went and followed Trump. Trump promised to, in his 2016 speech, defend the forgotten man. The working class that has been gutted, the middle class that has disappeared, all of these towns that are filled with fentanyl and opioid overdoses, and all of those social pathologies because their towns have been wrecked, the factories have been closed, all from these corporatist policies that Bill Clinton and the Republican Party, both before and after him, pursued because they were basically servants of the Chamber of Commerce. And there's still Republicans in the party, maybe even in the Trump movement, who still believe in that ideology, but many of them do not. There's a division that I find extremely important and extremely interesting to understand. And that's why there was a lot of hostility among certain Republican power players like the Chamber of Commerce and the Club for Growth to the selection of JD Vance, because he is not a traditional Republican when it comes to those sorts of economic issues.
I want to be clear. At the end of the day, the Teamsters are not interested if you have a D, R, or an I next to your name. We want to know one thing. What are you doing to help American workers? As a negotiator, I know that no window or door should ever be permanently shut. In my administration, the Teamsters reached out to 8 Republican senators who stood up for railroad Teamsters over our fight for paid sick leave. Josh Hawley was one of them.
Now, every time I mention that there are actually Republicans who are pursuing this more pro-worker, anti-corporatist mentality, that doesn't mean socialism. It means just standing up for basic rights of workers, for the right to a livable wage, to oppose corporate agendas like a flow of immigration that will drive down wages. It's why the American left had always opposed in the past open border immigration or a huge flow of illegal immigrants entering the country, because it was so bad for the American worker, until that got put through an identity politics prism where now anything is seen, any opposition to immigration is seen as racist or white nationalist, even though the groups that are most suspicious of massive immigration flows are African Americans and Latinos, because they understand that it is their jobs first that will suffer, their wages will suffer. And this just evades traditional left-right distinctions, but there are a lot of Democrats, a lot of liberals, and even a lot of people who identify as on the left who just cannot believe that there's any authentic belief in the working class if you're a member of the Republican Party. And every time I bring up Josh Hawley or JD Vance and Matt Stoller, who we're trying to get on our show this week if we can get him on, who has been on the show many times, who dedicates his life to antitrust work that JD Vance supports, and so does Josh Hawley, to prevent us from being enslaved by these gigantic monopolistic corporations that leave the consumer with no choice and therefore no rights. Every time I point that out or someone else points that out, these little liberals and leftists who are just in subservience to the Democratic Party come and say, oh, that's just all rhetoric. They never actually do anything. And you can point out very concrete things, like the time that Josh Hawley partnered with Bernie Sanders, the only two senators, to filibuster the COVID relief bill because they demanded that there be direct payments not only to corporations but also to American citizens. That was something Josh Hawley actually did with Bernie Sanders, and that resulted in major direct payments to American citizens because of the filibuster by those two. Or the list of pro-worker measures that JD Vance has taken in the Senate, as enumerated by the Teamster union president on the Fox News interview we showed you last night. But here he's going to talk about Josh Hawley and the things, not that he's said that are pro-worker and rhetoric, but the things that he has done over the past several years that are classically pro-worker.
We started talking. Senator Hawley changed his position on national right to work. Then we started walking. Senator Hawley walked a Teamsters picket line in St. Louis and a UAW picket line in Wentzville, Missouri. More than that, I want to recognize Senator Hawley for his direct, relentless, and pointed questioning of corporate talking heads, lawyers, CEOs, and apologists. He has shown he is not willing to accept their pillaging of working people's pocketbooks. I know from a career in negotiating that you get nowhere by slamming your fist on the table. The first step is to listen. The Teamsters and the GOP may not agree on many issues, but a growing group has shown the courage to sit down and consider points of view that aren't funded by big money think tanks.
So again, that's a pretty extraordinary thing to do, especially given that there are a lot of people in the labor movement and his own union who want to stay loyal to the Democratic Party because, I said, it's just sort of in their blood. It's like a lot of people who just were trained to love the Democratic Party and believe that the only good that can come is from the Democratic Party. But he's seeing this realignment that is obviously taking place, where it's not just in rhetoric but also in action, where the populist right of the Republican Party, the anti-establishment populist right, is having things in common with the left-wing populists who oppose the Democratic Party. Trump talked about that often in 2016. Bernie Sanders, you could go into a lot of labor unions and you could go into a lot of rural areas, and people in 2016 would say, the two favorite candidates of mine are Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. And to a lot of people who only see the world as Democrat versus Republican or left versus right, that's unimaginable because they're so connected to the partisan discourse that they can't understand or conceive of politics in any other way. But these ordinary Americans can. That was the version of Bernie Sanders that was not a partisan hack, that talked way more about trade and the working class than almost anything else, certainly more than social issues. And Trump would often say, I agree with Bernie on some of these things, including trade. And obviously when it comes to foreign policy as well, the criticism of the U.S. security state, these are all things that at least some people on the left still believe in, and there are growing beliefs on the right as well. And anybody who sits there and doesn't recognize this realignment that's obviously taking place, or who still insists on seeing this world in this archaic way of Democrats versus Republicans or conservative versus liberal, instead of the only real metric, which is what you think of establishment centers of power and their dogma, is somebody who is just incredibly stunted and blind. And it's fascinating that this president of the Teamsters Union, whose entire life has been devoted to labor, he's talked about the jobs, the working jobs that he's done over the course of many years to become a labor official, is able to analyze the political situation in this much more subtle and sophisticated way, and has the courage, knowing that it could jeopardize his position, to stand up and say it, because as he says, what he cares about is not Democrat versus Republican, but where the American worker can actually succeed and can actually thrive. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.